topic people don't really think about a whole lot. That's the ethics of organ transplantation. We know that organ transplantations are going on. Most of us probably don't know people who actually have had them, or only know a couple people who have had them, because they aren't terribly common, but they are going on with fair frequency. And most of us, when we hear about it, don't think anything much about the ethics that might be involved with it. But I'm going to suggest that maybe we should be thinking a bit more about this topic. I'm going to talk a fair amount about what I'm going to call the slippery slope of organ transplantation. The idea behind a slippery slope argument is you're standing at the top of a high slope. It's a snowy slope, icy slope. And you say to yourself, you're just going to take one step out onto the slope. And you're not going to go down to the bottom. But the problem is that it's slippery. And so you take one step out onto the slope and you slide all the way down to the bottom. So the picture within philosophy or argumentation is that you say, well, you know, I'm not going to go all the way down a certain area. I'm just going to take a tiny step. But you end up going the whole way. It's often used, say, in arguments about euthanasia. People will say, well, you know, we're just going to allow euthanasia in some very limited situations. And that's the small step. And then you slide all the way down to the bottom eventually, where euthanasia becomes very common and easy to get. And there's something similar, I think, going on in organ transplantation. This slide takes place because of an effort to get a greater supply of organs, because there's actually a pretty high demand for organs. But there's a pretty low supply, so there are long waiting lists. I'm sure it's the case in Poland, as in the United States, that there are very long waiting lists for people who need an organ, but they have to wait for somebody that can supply an organ. The first thing that was done with regard to organs was using paired organs, such as kidney. We have two kidneys, and we can actually survive with only one kidney. So if you could take a kidney from one living person and transplant it into another living person. But that's going to get a very limited supply of organs, and it's not going to get you any organs like, say, the heart, because we don't have two hearts. So you take out the heart, and then the person's dead. You can take out one kidney, and the person can survive. So there has to be another source for organs such as the heart or the liver, although they do partial liver transplants sometimes from living people. So where are we going to get these organs? Well, the kind of first step, as I see it in this slippery slope of organ transplantation, is the idea of brain death and taking organs from what we call brain-dead individuals. This is the idea of dead people with beating hearts. What's this mean? What's going on here? Well, the idea of brain death, which was actually widely accepted long before there were any clinical indicators of what counts for brain death, any studies of what brain death might be, or any philosophical explanation of brain death. The idea behind it is that the individual's brain is dead. Entirely dead is what's typically the case in most countries, except, say, the United Kingdom, but otherwise in most places in the world, the entire brain is dead. Nevertheless, the rest of the organs are kept alive. Well, how is that? How can you keep the rest of the organs alive? Well, it's actually a pretty simple mechanism that accomplishes this, namely a respirator which pumps air in and out of the lungs. And the heart can continue beating without the brain. We don't breathe without the brain, and hence the need for a respirator. But if you have oxygenated blood going through, being pumped through, and then if you want to keep the organs alive longer, you can supply nutrition, artificial hydration and nutrition, and individuals can be kept alive. Well, that's the dispute, whether the individual is kept alive or not. Certainly their organs can be kept alive, whether the individual is kept alive or not. They can be kept alive for long, long periods of time. I think the record is about 20 years that an individual has had at least the organs kept alive. So what's going on here, and why do I call this the first step of the slippery slope? It's actually the largest supply of organs that we have now is from brain-dead individuals. And it came about in 1968 in the United States. The Harvard Medical School convened a committee to investigate redefining death, and they came up with this idea of brain death. And actually, they didn't give a single medical justification for, or scientific justification for, brain death being the death of an individual. Rather, they said, gee, if brain death is death, we'll have more organs and we'll have more hospital beds available, right? So it was purely pragmatic. No effort to say, well, gee, actually science tells us that when the brain is dead, then the individual is dead as well. Later on, a justification was derived, which said that, an individual is a united organism, and the brain is the unifying organ of the whole person. So if the brain is dead, the unity is gone. So the idea is something like this. If you would, if we could, which we can't, but we can get somewhat close to this. If you could take a person apart and preserve all of the organs separately, except the brain, because the brain we're saying is going to be dead here, right? So you can take the heart, the lungs, the liver, various muscles, and so on. You keep them alive, only you ship them all over, Poland or all over the world, right? So you have, the heart off in Warsaw and the lungs off in Krakow, and keep, some parts here in Wrocław and so on. Nobody would say this individual is alive, even though all the organs are alive, right? Why? Because, he's alive because he's a unified individual, and he's clearly not unified when all his organs are spread all over the place, right? So that was a justification. Again, that didn't come until really organ transplantation on brain-dead individuals had already been practiced for about 13 years before finally we said, well, now we have a reason to believe, possibly, that brain death is death. But it turns out this justification for brain death has received extensive criticism. Probably the most prominent doctor criticizing this is Dr. by the name of Ellen Schumann at UCLA. He's a pediatric neurologist. And he's investigated lots of brain-dead individuals who have been kept alive, if you will, for many years. And he says, basically, there's not a shred of evidence that the brain is a unifying organ, right? That, in fact, when we see brain-dead individuals in the hospital, nobody supposes that we don't have a unified organ, including biologists and well-trained doctors. It clearly seems to be a unified organism going on here. So, and in fact, he'll point out to some of these individuals, like the individual who went on for 20 years, as I said, in this state of brain death, who actually was at home most of the time, being cared for at home, and maintained bodily temperature with the help of blankets, had wounds that would heal, fought off disease of various sorts, actually went through puberty because the individual was 5 years old when he went into brain death, and went through puberty, normal development through puberty, right? So Schumann's saying, look at this individual. You're telling me this isn't a unified organism, right? Now, clearly, we have a unified organism, even though the brain is dead. Indeed, they did an autopsy on just the brain at the end because some people were saying, okay, well, yeah, he's unified, but he's not really brain dead. It was a misdiagnosis. Well, it turns out his brain had calcified, that there was nothing really left there of the brain. So he was clearly brain dead, right? So it's actually undergone a lot of criticism recently, this idea of brain death. And that's led to really three positions on brain death, right? So the first is that brain death really is death, and taking the heart is not killing an individual. And again, that's sort of the legal situation in most places in the world, right? Brain death is defined as the death of the individual. The second and third view both say, well, no, the biological evidence indicates to us that brain death is not death. And the second position says, well, brain death is not death, and therefore taking somebody's heart out is actually killing the person, and that's morally problematic, right? Yes, we might be saving one person's life by transplanting a heart, but we're killing another person to do so. And the third position is that brain death is not death. The medical evidence indicates that it's not really death, but why not do it anyway? It's morally acceptable, at least in some situations. And so you can see this sort of situation of a slippery slope. The idea here is, well, you know, if a person's life isn't really worth living anymore, then and they're brain dead, well, yeah, we're killing them by taking out their heart, but we're saving somebody else's life whose life is worth a lot more, is the idea behind this third view that we have here. So you can see where I'm saying this is kind of a step onto a slippery slope of organ transplantation. Now, if the first view is correct and brain death really is death, then brain death is not the first step of the slippery slope, right? But it could still have provided the historical first step in the sense that really it was out of ignorance that people accepted brain death so eagerly. Even the Harvard Committee, looking at Harvard Medical School, lots of very intelligent people, but they gave no scientific reason to believe that brain death was death, right? So they were acting out of ignorance, really, right? So this idea that we're actually willing to promote morally questionable sources of organs makes it really the first step, even if it's true that brain death is death, right? Another step, and this is probably where we've made the biggest advance in most countries in this slippery slope, is what's often called donation after cardiac death, although it goes by lots of names. Usually I find when things go by lots of names, then people feel squeamish about them, and so we like to change the name, give them euphemistic names. But donation after cardiac death, so the idea behind this is that, well, we actually have two notions of death. In the United States, at least, this is the law, that you can be declared dead either because of brain death or because of cardiac death. Cardiac death is what we more traditionally think of death. The heart has stopped beating irreversibly, the person has stopped breathing irreversibly, and that's death, right? So what's going on in donation after cardiac death? Well, the idea here is we have somebody who's on life support, again, probably a ventilator, right? They're on a ventilator, but they're not brain dead. Nobody thinks they're brain dead. They clearly, by no standards, meet the notion of brain death. But the idea is, well, maybe they don't really have much of a life, not much reason to go on living, and maybe they themselves, at least when they were conscious, wanted to donate their organs. And so it'd be nice to declare these people dead. But problem is, they're not brain dead. That's one definition of death. And their heart's still beating, so you can't meet either definition of death. So how are we going to get the organs out of these people? Well, what you do is you take the person off the life support. So you take them off the respirator, for instance, and then you wait to see what happens. Typically, it's about an hour, but again, at least in the United States, it's kind of open, the Wild West, so to speak, in the sense that there are no actual laws that set rules for this, except in the United States, the law is that each hospital has to set its own rules. So it can vary from hospital to hospital. And I'm not sure what the practice is in Europe. I do know some of the standards are typically different in Europe, right? So, but anyway, you take them off life support, and then you wait to see what happens. Now, it may happen that they actually start breathing on their own, and it may happen that their heart continues beating. So then they end up being not either brain dead or cardiac dead, and you wait whatever set period of time, say an hour, and then you put them back on the respirator, and then that's that. You didn't get the organs. But what if they can't start breathing, and because they can't start breathing, maybe their heart stops beating? Now you can say they meet the cardiac notion of death, right? Because their heart had stopped beating. Now there's a worry here, because we typically think of cardiac death is that their heart has irreversibly stopped beating, because we know we can start people's hearts back up again, right? And they can start up on their own, the so-called Lazarus syndrome, where people, their hearts won't have beat for a while, and suddenly it'll start beating again, and they may come back to completely normal. So what goes on here, though, is that they decide not to try to start the person's heart up again, right? They decide, okay, well, if their heart stops beating, what we're going to do is just wait a set time period. Again, United States, that differs from hospital to hospital. Typically, it's about 2 minutes in the United States. In Europe, most countries, it's typically about 5 minutes. But at any rate, you wait a set period of time. If their heart does not start beating again on its own, we don't have the Lazarus syndrome, right? Then you declare them cardiac dead, and you take their organs, right? So this really provides, again, in the United States, most organs are from brain-dead individuals, about 90%, and the second largest group is from donation after cardiac death, about 10%. They're just less than 1% or so in general that are coming from others. We have issues here, of course. Ethically, you can see a kind of slippery slope that, well, is this person irreversibly lost their beating heart? Well, if so, only because we at least chose not to do anything about it, right? And we decided ahead of time we weren't going to do anything about it. Another step in this slope is anencephalic infants. These are infants who are born without a brain, or sometimes only a small part of the brain, right? And so they actually meet the standards of brain death, right? Because they don't have a living brain, right? And many of them will die pretty quickly, although with various treatments, they can sometimes live, even up to a year or possibly more. But typically, they're going to die within a couple of days, right? So they don't meet the they kind of meet the standards of brain death, except that they have no brain that can be dead. But they're actually able to breathe unassisted, some of them, right? And so ultimately, we just say, well, yeah, they aren't really living human beings, and so we'll take their organs from them. Another step in the slippery slope is changing what's called the dead donor rule. So this is an ethical standard and a legal standard in most countries. The idea is you cannot take an unpaired vital organ from somebody who's still alive. I've been sort of using that principle as I've gone along here without explicitly stating it. But the idea is if you take an unpaired vital organ like the heart out of somebody while they're still alive, then you're killing them in the process, right? And so the notion of a dead donor rule is you can take these non-paired vital organs only from somebody who's already dead, and hence brain death, right? So the law, again, in most countries, follows the dead donor rule. You need somebody who's dead to take these organs. And again, it's a standard moral principle. But there are lots of philosophers, lots of ethicists, lots of doctors pushing to have this dead donor rule removed. They say, look, we're already actually doing this because brain death isn't really death. whatever people say, whatever the law says, it's not really dead. So we're actually breaking the dead donor rule because these people are really alive. So let's just be more honest about this and just say, forget about the dead donor rule. If somebody's life isn't worth living, we can take their organs, right? Then we can actually give meaning to them by letting them save somebody else's life, right? So again, this is as we're sort of at the top of the slope, and we're sliding down as we go along here. Various steps that are taken with regard to donation of organs. Another step that's involved here is the loss of consent, right? So part of what goes on in organ donation is the idea, well, that people should consent to give their organs. So if somebody is brain dead, you take their organs only if they've consented to it. In the United States, that practice means they have to actually sign something saying, yes, I want to give my organs. In most countries in Europe, it's kind of the reverse. The assumption is you want to give your organs, you don't have to sign anything. But if you don't want to give your organs, then you can sign something and say that you won't give your organs. So it's called presumed consent. That, I think, is already kind of part of the slope that's going on there. But another step would be, well, why get consent at all? These people's lives aren't worth living if they're alive. If they're dead, then why does it matter that we're taking their organs? So we don't want selfish people to keep organs from people who need them, so to heck with consent, right? Let's just take organs whenever we think that it's important to take organs. Again, throughout this, the assumption is that organ transplantation is this great gift to society, and it warrants just this unremitting search for a new source of organs. But as we've suggested, there are some concerns here. This is a quote from two lawyers who looked into organ transplantation in China. They said, we should not be so naive as to think that just because transplant surgery was developed to do good, it can do no harm. And indeed, it can do great harm. A theologian by the name of Thomas Hurley says that there's a community interest in death, right? That we want more organs, therefore it'd be a great thing if more people were dying in such a way that we could get their organs, right? Now, when we look at this question of consent, it goes along with the idea that we're talking about organ donation, right? It's a gift, is the idea, right? So we actually have two things involved here. Yes, the person is consenting to it, and it's a gift. So there's another area of the slippery slope that says, well, forget about the gift. Maybe somebody just wants to sell their organs, right? So the idea of having a market in organs is promoted in various ways. And indeed, there is a market, at least a black market, throughout the world. A UN report estimated about 5 to 10% of kidneys worldwide are bought on the black market, right? It is legal in Iran. It was legal in Israel. It was legal in India. Both of those countries found that there were way too many abuses, and they made it illegal. But it continues to be legal in Iran. But most places, selling your organs is illegal. And indeed, the evidence indicates pretty strongly that what happens is that the poor people who are more economically desperate are the ones who will end up selling their organs to the rich people. The poor people need the money, and they may not be aware of medical risks that they might be undergoing. And so it really becomes a kind of abuse of the rich against the poor, I think, in practice, whether, that was the intent behind it. That's what goes on. As I've already mentioned, there's this idea of whittling away at consent to get this notion of conscripting organs. The final step here is not conscription of organs or taking of organs without consent from dead people, but taking them from live people. And you might begin by saying, well, I'm going to take them from people who are almost dead, who are, their lives are not really worth living anymore. Maybe they're selfishly withholding their organs, but we're going to take them anyway, right? But it's actually not too far of a step from that to say we want to do this just on, societal pariahs, people who are, unwanted in society in various ways. And probably most dramatically, this comes up in China. So in China, the accusation was made. It's been denied up and down by the government, okay? But I think the evidence is pretty strong that it was the case. The accusation was made is that they had this group, a kind of Buddhist group, Falun Gong, that was causing kind of political problems for the government. And so they rounded them up and they put them into concentration camps. And then they began selling their organs. And so actually some members of Falun Gong in Canada asked two lawyers to investigate whether this is actually going on. And at the time, there were websites up at hospitals in China where you could get a kidney for $70,000 and things like this, right? And these lawyers called up the hospitals and asked questions about getting organs, and they said, oh, yeah, we have lots of organs, which, as I said, is highly unusual, right, to have lots of organs. There are long waiting lists. And that was, in fact, the same case in China, that there were long waiting lists until they rounded up Falun Gong, and suddenly the waiting lists in China evaporated and they had organs to sell to foreigners, right? So and there's a whole list of other evidence that these two lawyers put together, basically showing that, yes, this is going on. They're selling these organs of people who are not almost dead. They're fully alive, but they're unwanted by the government, right? So they put out this report, and almost immediately after they put out this report, all these websites went down. You can no longer find a website in Chinese hospitals to buy organs. They went down after the report came up, but the lawyers think that it's still going on. It's just not as open as it was before. And other groups have now been brought in. The evidence is indicating, including Catholics in China, as it's not just Falun Gong, but other groups as well. Just as a closing note, there is the idea of an organ lottery. It's a lottery you don't want to win. It's a British philosopher who's kind of a little bit crazy, I suppose, anyway. But anyway, he says the organ lottery is that if your name is drawn in the organ lottery, that means you have to be cut up and all your organs given to people who need organs. So you don't want to win this lottery, the organ lottery. But he says this is the only fair way to do it, right? We want to be fair, and so we just want it to be random who's going to be killed to give the organs towards others. I guess maybe it's a little fairer than what's going on in China in some way or other, but indeed, it seems to me we've reached to the bottom of the slippery slope when we get to the organ lottery. Thank you very much.